You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Vendor strategy in artificial intelligence refers to the framework organizations use when deciding how to obtain, deploy, and manage AI capabilities. This strategy shapes not only which technologies are adopted, but also how risks, responsibilities, and long-term dependencies are handled. AI is unlike many other forms of enterprise software in that it evolves quickly, depends on complex datasets, and carries both technical and ethical obligations. As a result, vendor choices determine not only performance but also compliance, governance, and future flexibility. A strong vendor strategy balances the benefits of speed and external expertise against the risks of lock-in, hidden costs, and reduced control. For enterprises, the question is not whether to engage with vendors but how to do so wisely, ensuring that vendor relationships align with organizational priorities and regulatory expectations. Defining vendor strategy involves more than procurement. It encompasses decisions about whether to adopt open-source solutions, contract with closed proprietary providers, or build internal capabilities. Each approach has strengths and weaknesses, and most enterprises mix them in hybrid strategies. Vendor strategy also involves structuring contracts, establishing governance oversight, and planning for exit scenarios. The choices made here ripple across the lifecycle of AI deployment, affecting cost, compliance, and innovation. For boards and executives, vendor strategy is therefore not a narrow IT concern but a strategic decision with implications for competitiveness and trustworthiness. By treating it as such, organizations elevate vendor management to a critical component of AI governance. The debate between open and closed models is central to vendor strategy. Open-source AI systems provide transparency, flexibility, and community support, allowing enterprises to adapt and inspect models as needed. Closed proprietary models, by contrast, offer polished performance, enterprise-grade support, and integration into vendor-managed ecosystems. Each model type reflects different philosophies. Open systems emphasize democratization and independence, while closed systems emphasize performance and reliability. For enterprises, the choice is rarely absolute. Instead, it depends on factors such as budget, compliance requirements, and tolerance for risk. Understanding the differences between open and closed models is therefore the starting point for vendor strategy, as it sets the boundaries for what is possible in procurement and deployment. The advantages of open-source models include lower entry costs, greater transparency, and freedom to customize. Open systems allow enterprises to examine training data, modify architectures, and fine-tune models for domain-specific needs. They also avoid vendor lock-in, since organizations can switch providers or run models independently. Open communities provide rapid innovation, with frequent updates and shared best practices. For organizations with strong technical teams, open models provide both flexibility and control. However, the very openness that makes them attractive also places greater responsibility on adopters to manage security, compliance, and scaling. The decision to adopt open-source AI must therefore be paired with robust internal expertise, ensuring that the benefits of freedom do not collapse into unmanaged risk. The limitations of open-source models become clear when enterprises seek enterprise-grade support, scalability, or compliance assurances. Open models may lack service-level agreements, leaving organizations responsible for troubleshooting and maintenance. They may not provide compliance documentation for regulations such as HIPAA or GDPR, requiring additional investment in audits and legal oversight. Scaling open systems across millions of users can also be resource-intensive, demanding significant infrastructure and operational expertise. These challenges do not negate the value of open source but highlight the costs of independence. Enterprises must weigh whether their teams have the skills and resources to sustain open models responsibly. In many cases, organizations blend open models with vendor support to combine transparency with reliability. Closed proprietary models offer advantages that appeal to many enterprises. Vendors often provide systems that are pre-optimized, with high performance, robust reliability, and dedicated support teams. These models are often trained on larger datasets with greater resources than most organizations can assemble independently. Vendors also provide compliance certifications, integration tools, and regular updates, reducing the burden on enterprises. For organizations seeking rapid deployment, closed systems provide a turnkey solution that accelerates adoption. They shift responsibility for maintenance, scaling, and compliance to providers, freeing internal teams to focus on applications rather than infrastructure. This appeal explains why many enterprises begin their AI journey with closed systems, even if they later consider hybrid approaches. The limitations of closed systems are equally important. Proprietary vendors may restrict transparency, preventing organizations from understanding how models are trained or what biases may be embedded. They may also impose usage restrictions that limit flexibility or create vendor lock-in. Dependence on a single provider can make it difficult to switch if pricing increases, contracts expire, or performance fails to meet expectations. Closed systems may also stifle innovation by reducing opportunities for customization. These risks remind enterprises that convenience comes at the cost of independence. Strong vendor strategies must therefore include plans for exit and portability, ensuring that reliance on closed systems does not become a long-term liability. The buy versus build trade-off is another central consideration. Buying from a vendor accelerates deployment, allowing enterprises to leverage mature systems with immediate functionality. Building internally, by contrast, offers customization, control, and the ability to align systems precisely with organizational needs. Building requires significant investment in talent, infrastructure, and governance, making it feasible only for organizations with deep technical resources. Buying requires less expertise, but carries the risks of lock-in and limited flexibility. The decision is rarely binary. Most enterprises adopt hybrid approaches, buying for general capabilities, while building in-house for domain-specific systems. This blended approach balances speed with independence, aligning vendor strategy with long-term goals. Hybrid strategies are increasingly common, combining open models with proprietary vendor solutions to balance strengths and weaknesses. For example, an enterprise might deploy open-source models for research and experimentation, while relying on closed systems for production workloads requiring reliability and compliance. Hybrid strategies also allow organizations to manage costs, using open systems to avoid vendor fees where possible, and reserving vendor contracts for areas requiring support. These strategies require careful integration and governance but provide flexibility, reducing dependence on any single approach. Hybridization demonstrates that vendor strategy is not about ideological purity, but practical balance, ensuring resilience across evolving technical and regulatory landscapes. Contract red flags represent some of the most immediate risks in vendor relationships. Agreements may include restrictive terms that limit how models can be used, hidden fees that inflate costs, or vague liability clauses that expose enterprises to risk. For example, a contract that omits clear ownership of outputs may leave organizations uncertain about whether they can commercialize AI-generated content. Others may include excessive termination penalties, trapping enterprises in unfavorable arrangements. Identifying red flags requires technical, legal, and governance teams to collaborate in contract review, ensuring that no hidden risks undermine adoption. Contracts are not just formalities. They define the contours of responsibility, risk, and accountability in AI deployment. Service-level agreements, or SLAs, are central components of vendor contracts, defining expectations for uptime, response times, and support obligations. An SLA is essentially a performance guarantee, committing vendors to maintain certain standards. For enterprises, SLAs provide assurance that systems will remain available and reliable. For example, a financial services firm may require 99.99% uptime to ensure compliance with trading regulations. SLAs also define remedies if performance falls short, such as service credits or penalties. Reviewing SLAs carefully is essential to vendor strategy. as vague or weak commitments can leave organizations exposed to downtime or failures without recourse. Compliance requirements must also be embedded into contracts, ensuring that vendor systems align with privacy, security, and regulatory obligations. For example, vendors handling healthcare data must provide assurances of HIPAA compliance, while those handling European data must adhere to GDPR. Contracts should specify how compliance is verified, what documentation is provided, and what liability vendors assume if breaches occur. Without explicit commitments, enterprises may find themselves accountable for failures they cannot control. Governance teams must therefore review vendor contracts not only for financial terms but also for regulatory alignment, ensuring that compliance is a shared responsibility. Vendor lock-in risk is one of the most well-known concerns in strategy. When organizations rely too heavily on one provider, they lose leverage in negotiations and face barriers to switching. Lock-in can occur through proprietary APIs, closed data formats, or unique model architectures that are difficult to replicate elsewhere. While vendors have incentives to foster dependence, enterprises must protect their flexibility. Strategies to mitigate lock-in include adopting open standards, using multiple providers, and negotiating strong exit terms. Recognizing lock-in as a strategic risk ensures that organizations maintain long-term agility rather than being trapped in costly or restrictive arrangements. Exit strategies are essential for managing this risk, ensuring that organizations can terminate vendor relationships without losing access to critical data or systems. Contracts should specify data portability, defining how models, embeddings, or outputs will be transferred upon termination. They should also include provisions for transition support, giving enterprises time to migrate without disruption. Exit strategies are not signs of distrust but of maturity, reflecting the reality that vendor relationships may evolve or end. By planning for exit, organizations ensure that vendor strategy is resilient, protecting business continuity in changing environments. Governance oversight ensures that vendor strategy is reviewed not only by technical teams but also by compliance officers, legal experts, and boards of directors. Vendor decisions carry strategic, financial, and regulatory implications that require cross-functional input. Oversight processes ensure that contracts align with organizational values, regulatory obligations, and long-term goals. They also create accountability, ensuring that vendor management is not left to isolated teams. By embedding governance into vendor strategy, organizations demonstrate maturity and responsibility, showing stakeholders that external partnerships are managed as carefully as internal systems. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Cost structures are one of the first considerations when evaluating AI vendors, as they determine the financial feasibility of long-term adoption. Vendors may charge per token, per API call, per user subscription, or enterprise-wide licensing fees. Each of these models has different implications for scalability. Per token or per query pricing can be cost-effective at small volumes, but may become prohibitively expensive as usage grows. Subscription or enterprise licenses offer predictability, which many organizations prefer, but can result in underutilization if demand is lower than projected. A strong vendor strategy requires mapping cost structures against anticipated workloads, ensuring that financial commitments align with actual usage patterns. Without this analysis, organizations risk either overspending on pay-as-you-go systems or underutilizing costly flat-rate contracts. Hidden costs represent another challenge in vendor agreements, as the headline price may not reflect the total expense of adoption. Integration costs, such as adapting workflows, customizing APIs, or retraining staff, can easily exceed the vendor's fees. Ongoing usage charges, storage costs, or bandwidth expenses may also add up, particularly in high-volume applications. Vendors may charge for premium features such as advanced monitoring, compliance certifications, or dedicated support. A vendor strategy must therefore go beyond the contract surface to uncover these hidden expenses, using detailed cost modeling and pilot deployments to estimate total cost of ownership. Transparency in budgeting is critical since unexpected costs can erode ROI and undermine stakeholder confidence. Vendor transparency is equally critical, particularly regarding training data, model capabilities, and limitations. Enterprises must understand whether a model's training data complies with copyright, licensing, and regulatory obligations. They must also be informed of biases, performance limits, and known risks. Vendors that withhold details may expose their clients to legal or reputational harm. Transparency also builds trust, giving organizations the information they need to integrate AI responsibly. For example, a healthcare provider adopting AI for diagnostics must demand assurance that training data meets PHI handling requirements. Transparency is therefore not just a courtesy but a requirement for compliance, accountability, and risk management. Security in vendor systems is a non-negotiable requirement, since outsourcing AI services does not outsource accountability. Vendors handling sensitive information must demonstrate robust encryption, secure storage, and access controls. Contracts should specify how data is handled during transmission, processing, and retention. For example, financial institutions may require vendors to store data only in approved geographic regions to comply with regulations. Vendors should also provide documentation of security audits, certifications, and penetration testing. Weak security practices at a vendor can expose enterprises to breaches, making it essential that vendor strategy includes rigorous due diligence in this area. Security lapses erode trust not only in vendors but also in the organizations that chose them, reinforcing why governance teams must review technical safeguards carefully. Intellectual property concerns must also be addressed in vendor contracts, particularly around ownership of outputs and derivative models. Enterprises must clarify whether they own the rights to AI-generated outputs, whether vendors retain any claim, and how intellectual property disputes will be handled. If outputs are used commercially, organizations must ensure that licensing terms support that usage. Contracts should also specify whether derivative models, fine-tuned from vendor systems using enterprise data, belong to the customer or the vendor. Without clear terms, enterprises may inadvertently surrender control over their own innovations. Intellectual property clarity is therefore central to vendor strategy, shaping whether AI deployments enhance organizational assets or dilute them through ambiguous ownership. Support and maintenance commitments vary widely across vendors, making them another key factor in vendor strategy. Some vendors offer 24/7 support with guaranteed response times, while others provide only community forums or limited assistance. The frequency of updates, patching, and bug fixes also varies. For enterprises, reliable support is essential, especially in mission-critical domains like healthcare or finance. Contracts should specify support levels explicitly, including escalation paths, response times, and remedies for failures. Without these assurances, enterprises risk being left vulnerable during outages or security incidents. Vendor strategy must therefore balance performance with the reliability of ongoing support, recognizing that AI systems require continuous stewardship long after deployment. Customization options are increasingly important as enterprises demand AI systems tailored to their domains. Vendors may provide APIs for fine-tuning, domain-specific datasets, or integration into existing enterprise software. Customization ensures that AI reflects the unique needs of industries such as law, medicine, or finance. However, customization may also increase costs or introduce dependencies on vendor tools. Enterprises must weigh the benefits of tailored solutions against the risks of being tied too closely to one vendor's ecosystem. A mature vendor strategy considers not only immediate functionality, but also long-term flexibility, ensuring that customizations enhance competitiveness without compromising future independence. Benchmark comparisons provide organizations with evidence to evaluate vendors fairly. By testing multiple providers against the same datasets, latency requirements, and compliance standards, enterprises can make informed choices rather than relying on marketing claims. Benchmarks might test accuracy, bias, safety, scalability, or cost efficiency. Public benchmarks provide one baseline, but enterprises often design internal benchmarks tailored to their specific use cases. Comparative testing ensures that vendor decisions are grounded in data, not persuasion. It also provides negotiating leverage, as enterprises can demonstrate that alternatives perform equally well or better. Benchmarking is thus not only a technical exercise but also a strategic tool in vendor selection and negotiation. Multi-vendor strategies reduce risk by diversifying reliance across multiple providers. Instead of depending exclusively on one vendor, organizations may deploy several, using different providers for different tasks or maintaining backups in case of disruption. For example, a global enterprise might use one provider for language translation and another for compliance monitoring, ensuring that a failure in one system does not cripple operations. Multi-vendor strategies also provide negotiating power, as vendors know they are competing rather than monopolizing. However, managing multiple vendors requires stronger governance, since complexity increases. The trade-off is worthwhile for many enterprises, as diversification reduces lock-in and increases resilience. The risk of over-reliance on vendors extends beyond lock-in to the erosion of internal expertise. When organizations depend too heavily on external providers, they may neglect to build internal skills, leaving them vulnerable if vendors fail, raise prices, or change terms. Over-reliance also reduces innovation, as enterprises lose the capacity to experiment independently. A strong vendor strategy therefore includes provisions for internal knowledge building, training, and parallel development. Even when vendors provide core capabilities, organizations must retain enough expertise to evaluate, integrate, and govern responsibly. Balancing vendor reliance with internal competency ensures that organizations remain in control of their technological destiny. Due diligence in vendor selection requires thorough assessments across technical, financial, and legal dimensions. Technical reviews evaluate performance, security, and compliance. Financial assessments examine vendor stability, pricing models, and long-term sustainability. Legal reviews scrutinize contracts for clarity, risk allocation, and regulatory alignment. Together, these evaluations provide a holistic picture of whether a vendor is a reliable partner. Skipping due diligence exposes organizations to risks that may only surface later, such as hidden costs, weak security, or licensing violations. Formalizing due diligence as part of governance ensures that vendor choices are responsible, defensible, and aligned with organizational priorities. Case studies provide instructive examples of how vendor strategies succeed or fail in practice. Some enterprises have thrived by adopting hybrid strategies, combining open-source flexibility with vendor reliability. Others have struggled with lock-in, finding themselves unable to exit costly contracts when vendors changed terms. Healthcare organizations have faced scrutiny for using vendors without sufficient PHI safeguards, while financial firms have been penalized for poor compliance in vendor contracts. These case studies demonstrate that vendor strategy is not abstract but concrete, shaping outcomes in terms of cost, trust, and regulatory standing. Learning from both successes and failures strengthens future vendor decisions. Negotiation best practices allow enterprises to secure favorable pricing, liability terms, and exit rights. Organizations should approach vendor contracts as collaborative but competitive processes, recognizing that terms are negotiable. Best practices include benchmarking before negotiations, demanding transparency about training data and compliance, securing indemnification clauses, and embedding clear exit strategies. Enterprises should also negotiate tiered pricing, where costs decrease as usage increases, ensuring scalability remains affordable. Strong negotiation reduces long-term risks, turning vendor relationships into partnerships rather than dependencies. By institutionalizing best practices, enterprises elevate procurement from a transactional activity to a strategic tool of governance. The future of vendor ecosystems is trending toward modularity and interoperability. Vendors increasingly offer APIs, integrations, and standards that allow organizations to mix and match capabilities from different providers. Interoperability reduces lock-in, enabling enterprises to switch components without disrupting entire systems. Modularity also aligns with hybrid strategies, allowing organizations to combine open-source models, proprietary APIs, and in-house systems seamlessly. As ecosystems mature, enterprises will prioritize vendors who embrace openness and interoperability, rejecting those who foster dependency. This shift reflects a broader movement in AI governance toward flexibility, transparency, and shared responsibility. Vendor ecosystems of the future will not be monolithic but networked, reflecting the complexity and diversity of enterprise needs. As vendor strategies mature, they naturally transition into change management, ensuring that chosen strategies succeed in practice. Selecting vendors is only the first step. Organizations must then integrate them, train staff, adapt workflows, and monitor outcomes. Change management ensures that vendor choices translate into adoption rather than resistance, building user trust and aligning systems with organizational culture. This continuity underscores that vendor strategy is not isolated, but part of a broader governance journey, where procurement, compliance, and culture intersect to shape responsible AI adoption. Vendor strategy, then, is the practice of aligning technology choices with organizational priorities, balancing openness, control, and risk. It involves evaluating open versus closed systems, weighing buy versus build trade-offs, and negotiating contracts with clarity and foresight. Strong strategies identify red flags, prevent lock-in, and embed compliance, ensuring that vendor relationships serve as assets rather than liabilities. As ecosystems evolve, modularity and interoperability will reduce dependency, empowering organizations to shape their own AI futures. Enterprises that treat vendor strategy as governance rather than procurement build resilience, trust, and adaptability, ensuring that AI adoption is sustainable and aligned with business values. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.